This is a story of Peter as Luke's covering the various miracles that Peter performed. And in verse 36, we see him do something that we haven't seen an apostle do yet, which is raise someone from the dead. In Acts 9, verse 36, at Joppa, there was a certain disciple named Tabitha, which is translated Dorcas. This woman was full of good works and charitable deeds, which she did. But it happened in those days that she became sick and died. When they washed her, they laid her on the upper room. And since Lydda was near Joppa, and the disciples had heard that Peter was there, they sent 2 men to him, imploring him not to delay in coming to them. Then Peter arose and went with them. When he had come, they brought him to the upper room, and all the widows stood by him weeping, showing the tunics and garments which Dorcas had made while she was with them. But Peter put them all out, knelt down and prayed, and turned to the body. He said, "Tabitha, arise." And she opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up. Then he gave her his hand and lifted her up. And when he had called the saints and widows, he presented her alive. And it became known throughout all of Joppa, and many believed on the Lord. So it was that he stayed many days in Joppa with Simon a tanner. If you're visiting with us this morning, we're thankful that you're here. But you need to understand that this group has been grieving for 3 sisters back to back this summer. We lost Miss Anita, and then we lost Miss Marita, and then this week we lost Miss Donna, who battled cancer for almost 9 years and found a victory just this past week, only in her 60s. And this group is grieving, and we need to grieve together about that. We need to weep with each other. We need to have joy with each other over those things. But I can imagine that if we had had the opportunity to send 2 men to Joppa and to bring one of those sisters back, I think we would do it. And I think it's fine to call me selfish in saying so, but these Christians, when they heard that Peter was close by, they sent Peter to come and bring back their Tabitha because they thought that they needed her. They implored Peter to come and bring her back. When they got there in verse 39, I have a question for us. These widows wait for Peter as he enters in the room and then begin to show him the tunics and the clothes that she had made them. What was the purpose of those widows having those clothes raised so Peter could see them as they implored him to raise her up? What was the purpose of all that? Was it just a show and tell, or what's going on here? Well, let me propose to you that the reason why these women had these clothes out is because they thought they had to convince Peter to bring her back. And that they needed something. This was part of this imploring process. They were telling Peter, "Look, Peter, we need her. We need her back, Peter. Look how helpful she is. Look how useful she is to the kingdom. We need her, Peter." And you can only experience or imagine the joy that when Peter puts them all out of the room, goes up to the upper room, prays about it, and tells Tabitha to arise. And then 4 footsteps walk down from the upper room. And Tabitha is restored for these people. This passage has brought me a lot of comfort this week and has given me a lot of encouragement. And my only purpose in preaching this morning is I would like to share that encouragement that I found in this passage. This concept that Tabitha came back. And through the power of Jesus, Tabitha was restored to these brethren. I said already that if we had the opportunity to bring someone back, I think we would do it because these Christians did it. You know, I was thinking to myself and I was asking Emily, if we had the opportunity to go get Peter, what would we show Peter about Miss Donna? And I know that we could show quilts and clothes, but I think I would show him those 5-page text messages she used to send me and all the encouragement that she would give. I think I would tell Peter about the time she corrected me and told me I was wrong. But I would be very careful about which stories that I shared about what I needed to be corrected about. I was thinking of one specifically that I think is okay to share. I remember when I was maybe 24, 23, I had a study with Malia and Christina and Alexa. And for some reason, Malia wanted to study Ecclesiastes, right? That was a very difficult book. And I was only 24. I asked Donna to come and be part of that study with me to help me out. I specifically remember Donna, this is a ladies' class, right? I'm supposedly teaching it. And I specifically remember Donna saying, y'all ladies, you remember the 3 W's of Solomon, right? And Donna meant the 3 W's of Solomon being women, wisdom, and wealth. And as soon as Donna said the 3 W's, I said, that's right, women, women, women. And I said, as you can see, the women were the problem. And Donna went, no. And I think she said, Andrew, please. And Donna's got us back on track on our study. You know, there were corrections. Sometimes there were a lot of corrections. But even in those corrections, what was she? She was useful. She was helpful. She was needed for the kingdom. And there's certainly different things that we could share with Peter to implore him to bring her back. But what the good news is that Tabitha lived on. And it didn't necessarily take Peter for them to guarantee that Tabitha lived on. And even though Tabitha would one day die again, she would continue to live on. And all I'd like to do is from here on out is just show how Tabitha lived on in 2 different ways. The first way that Tabitha lived on was that her good works lived on, specifically in the clothes that she made, right? Verse 39 says that she had the tunics and the garments that she had made while she was with them, and the clothes were still there. The good works still existed, and those widows still had those clothes in their hands, and I imagine they were also wearing them. You know, it is very possible for us to do good works in this life, and those good works live longer than we do. You think about some of the Bible class material we use. Sometimes we'll use Bible class material made by people that had passed on a long time ago. Do their good works continue? Yes, their good works do continue. And our good works too can live on after we're gone. But not only specifically good works, but think about the encouragement that she instilled in those women. There was a reason why they wanted her back. And I don't think necessarily it was just because she made good clothes. I think it's because she was an encouragement to them. And that encouragement would have been passed down to other sisters. Look at 2 Timothy chapter 2 with me. 2 Timothy chapter 2. For you people that sew or knit or quilt or do these different things that Tabitha could also do, where did you learn it from? How do you know how to do that? I think some of y'all are pretty clever, and you may say, oh, I picked up a book and I figured it out, and I would be impressed if you said that. But I think most of us would answer, well, I learned how to sew from my mom, or I learned how to knit from an aunt or a grandmother, or maybe just a sister that I loved, and they taught me how to do that. And certainly, I think that's a lot of the ways that we pick up these abilities. If you learned it from your mother, well, then who did she learn it from? Do you have the answer to that? Maybe a few of us do, but many of us could probably say, well, I learned from my mother, and my mother learned how to sew from this woman. But can you name the next woman up the chain that taught her how to sew? I think the further we go up, we realize we don't know names anymore. But even though we may not know that person's name on our chain that gave us that ability, are we still not grateful and thankful and benefit from them taking the time to teach that lady how to sew? Yes, we are, right? It is still helpful even though we don't know their name, because this is how these things get passed down. These are how these things are handed down. And I think encouragement and edification works the same exact way. Look at 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 1. You therefore, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus, and the things that you have heard from among me among many witnesses, commit these to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. If you notice in this passage, there's actually 4 generations being talked about. Paul is telling Timothy to go out and teach faithful men so they can go out and teach others also. That's 4 links in those chains all the way going back to Paul. And what's the concept here with edification? I know that some of us are really clever and we can pick up the books like Timothy had the books and we can figure it out for our own. But I think for most of us, we had men and women in our lives that sat us down and explained these things to us. They taught us Jesus and his gospel. And what does that chain go all the way back to? That chain would go all the way back up to Paul himself. Do we benefit from those things that happen? Those people whose names we don't even know, but they decided to take the time to invest and teach? Yes, we do. And we were taught by who they were taught by, and we were going to teach who they were going to be taught by. And the chain just keeps on going and going. Encouragement works this way as well. Look at 1 Thessalonians 3. 1 Thessalonians 3, hopefully just flip a few pages backwards. Paul was eager to go encourage the Thessalonians, but he couldn't meet with them, so he sends Timothy. Chapter 3, verse 1. Therefore, when we could no longer endure it, we thought it good to be left in Athens alone, and sent Timothy, our brother and minister of God, and our fellow laborer in the gospel of Christ, to establish you and encourage you concerning your faith. Paul sends Timothy to the Thessalonians to establish them and encourage them in the faith. Was Timothy's encouragement completely original? Did it just start with him and he gave it to the Thessalonians? Or do we have a situation here where Paul encouraged Timothy and Timothy went and passed on that encouragement to the Thessalonians? I think that's a more likely story here. Many of you know, and I've talked about this before, but before I moved here, I lived in Tuscaloosa. And at Tuscaloosa, there was a man named Justin Roberson, who we supported for a good amount of years, who encouraged me. He took care of me. He talked to me. He studied with me. You know who Justin Roberson learned how to encourage people and how to study people from? If you ask Justin, he'll tell you. He learned it from David Hartzell. And David Hartzell instilled in him and encouraged in him and edified him. And if we had the opportunity to ask David Hartzell, who encouraged and studied with him? Who built him up so he could do the things that he did? Would he not mention many of you here at Gardendale? Was not Clayton Barnes an encouragement to David Hartzell? Was not David Hartzell an encouragement to Justin Roberson? Was not Justin Roberson an encouragement to me? Was Clayton Barnes encouraging me before I even met him? I think he was. Because I think that's how encouragement works. When I come and I encourage you, y'all, Andrew's not coming up with original things to say to you. All Andrew's doing is pulling things from people that he's heard from other places, and he wants to give it to you, so he passes it along. And we are in chains and chains upon links of encouragement. And that's how I believe Jesus wants his church to operate. So we pass down to generations, people that we don't even know. But that encouragement lives on. Last year when Ruby was born, Donna made a quilt for Ruby. And, all right, I'm going to get through with it. She made a quilt for Ruby, and she gave Emily a letter when she made the quilt. And the letter was very sweet. It just said that she loved us. But she told us in the letter that she didn't think she was going to be with us much longer. But she wanted Ruby to have this quilt. Emily got home from work with the quilt and the letter, sat it down in front of me and said, well, Ruby has a quilt. Ruby hadn't been born yet. And here's the letter. And after reading the letter, I remember I looked at Emily and I said, Emily, I don't want this quilt. I want Miss Donna. You know, the quilt's nice. The quilt's special. But I'd rather have Miss Donna. And I remember saying, you know, I want Donna to be around to teach Ruby in Bible class. I want Donna to pull her aside after church and talk to her about something. You know, maybe one day I want Donna to send 5-page long text messages to Ruby. That's what I want. But that's not what was given. And this is how I've reconciled with that thought. Ruby's not going to have Miss Donna to tell her embarrassing stories about her father and the crazy things he said in Bible class. But Ruby is going to have many of the sisters here. Ruby's not going to have Miss Donna teach her Bible class, but she is going to have sisters here that were taught by Miss Donna. Will Donna be there? Will her encouragement be there? Yes, it will. You know, Ruby's not going to have Donna to send these long text messages to, but I'm sure Rachel will send long text messages to Ruby one day. Will Donna be there? Yes, Donna will be there. And that's good enough. That encouragement is going to be passed down. And when other sisters that were influenced by her pass those things down to the next generation, her good works will live on. And eventually there will come a time at Gardale, Lord willing, that actually no one here will know Donna's name. They won't know our names either. But will they know the Lord's name? If we encourage and edify like we're supposed to, they will know the Lord's name, and that's the only name they need to know. And our good works will live on. And that's something that has definitely been encouraging to me. Not only did Tabitha's good works live on, but she also literally lived on, right? And that was obviously validated in the miracle. Why was Tabitha raised? And you don't have to turn back to Acts 9. I'll give it to you right here. In verse 42, Acts 9 says that she was raised so that many would believe in the Lord. And that's exactly what happened. Many came to believe in the Lord because Tabitha was raised. And what this did was validated the apostles' message of life in Jesus. If Peter's out there preaching that Jesus can give you eternal life and he raises people from the dead, you're inclined to believe him because you can't promise one and not do the other. The other thing that it does is it validates that Jesus does have the keys to Hades. He has the keys to death. And why was Tabitha able to be raised? Is because Jesus could unlock the realm of the dead and bring Tabitha back. Turn to the book of Revelation. Look at Revelation 1, verse 18. This book, mostly written to encourage Christians not to fear death, but understand that even under the threat of murder, that Jesus still has them. So there's a lot of conversations here about what happens when we die. Revelation 1:18, Jesus introduces himself to John. He says, I am he who lives and was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore. Amen. I have the keys of Hades and of death. When Jesus says Hades there, he's taken us back to something he already taught us in Luke 16. And if you remember, Jesus tells the story of the rich man and Lazarus. And he says that when the rich man and the Lazarus died, they both go to Hades. Lazarus is carried by the angels to Abraham, and the rich man is carried down to Hades in the side of torment. So Hades is the realm of the dead, all dead. And what does Jesus have to it? He has the keys. He controls it. And if he wants to bring Tabitha back, he brings Tabitha back. If he wants to escape himself like he did for the resurrection, he escapes for the resurrection. He owns this place. And he's telling Christians he owns this place. So what should we have? We should have great assurance and great confidence that Jesus will preserve us even after death. Let's stay in Revelation. Look in chapter 2. Look at what Jesus says there. Another concept about death, but here clarifying, talking about the second death. He tells the church at Smyrna here, verse 11, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death. Jesus starts here at the very beginning saying he controls death and then tells those, if you're an overcomer like me, I will ensure you that you will not be hurt by the second death. And let me put our second death here up on the screen. Let's clarify these terms by looking at these passages. Look at chapter 20, verse 14. 20:14. The passage reads here, Then death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. And anyone not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. And this is after the judgment scene in Revelation 20. Look in 21 verse 8. 21 verse 8 says, but the cowardly, unbelieving, abominable murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. When Jesus here is talking about the second death, what is he talking about? Well, this is the word that Jesus gives us in the gospel. I think it's fitting. This is hell. And there is a second death, which has nothing to do with the first death. But Jesus ensures his people that if you will be my disciple, I will make sure you will not be cast into the lake of fire. You will not have to experience the second death. If there's a second death, then what does that absolutely mean there also has to be? If Jesus keeps on saying second death, what must there also be? Well, naturally, there also must be a first death. You don't say this is number two unless number one already exists. What would be the first death? You don't have to turn there. Maybe we'd rather stay in Revelation. But Hebrews 9:27 says, it is appointed for all men to die once. That every single one of us, unless the Lord returns and we meet him in the air, every single one of us is going to die one day. And we don't know how exactly it's going to happen. But we are all going to die. When Jesus says that if you overcome, you will not be hurt by the second death, he does not say if you overcome, you will not be hurt by the first death. The first death is basically guaranteed. So the first death is something we all experience. And some go to the first death with confidence. And some people go to the first death in fear. But Jesus tries to ensure us that this is exactly what's going to happen to all of us. And what would this place be called? Well, I'd say it'd be Hades. Going back to Luke 16, the realm of the dead that Jesus has the keys to. If there's a first death and a second death, it's interesting to find in Revelation 20 that there's also a first resurrection. Look at Revelation 20. Some go to this passage and say that the first resurrection is baptism. But I want you to notice in this passage that everyone he's talking about is dead. Every single one. Verse 4, John says, and I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was committed to them. Then I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the witness to Jesus for the word of God, who had not worshiped the beast or his image, and had not received the mark on their foreheads or on their hands. And they lived and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. But the rest of the dead did not live again until the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is he who is part in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but they shall be priests of God and of Christ, and they shall reign with him 1,000 years. When John's here talking about the 1,000-year reign, he's talking about the age of the church. That's what it has to be in the context. And if you have a question about that, please come and ask me after, and I'd be happy to explain why I believe that. But here now in the age of the church, Jesus is reigning as king. And what are the dead doing? Well, some of the dead stay dead until the second resurrection. But some get to experience the first resurrection. And John says in this first resurrection, they reign with Jesus as priests and kings. And they get to experience the joy of the church and the kingdom, even though they are dead and they have been beheaded for the sake of Christ. That they get to experience a life after death that's better than the life they're living here on this earth. And Jesus calls this the first resurrection. So what I would like to label this as is what Jesus told the thief on the cross in Luke. He says, tonight you'll be with me in paradise. Jesus ensures this guy, today, you and me are going to leave here and we're going to be in paradise. And I equate that with the same place that Lazarus went to be with Abraham. And I equate that right here with this being the first resurrection. Is there life after death? Jesus says there is life after death. And if Jesus says it, that's good enough with me. Now, if there's a first resurrection and there's a second death, shouldn't there also be a second resurrection? Look at 20 verse 12. This is the final resurrection. Verse 12, he says, and I saw the dead, small and great, standing before God. And books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged according to their works by the things which were written in the books. The sea gave up the dead who were in it, and death and Hades delivered up the dead who were in them. And they were judged with each one according to his works. Then death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. And anyone not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. What was this here? This was resurrection for judgment, where Jesus takes the realm of the dead, Hades, and he empties it. And everyone's raised from the dead, both good and evil, according to 1 Corinthians 15. And they are all raised for the purpose of the judgment. And the books are open, including the book of life. And those whose names are not written in the book of life have to experience the second death. But those whose names are in the book of life, obviously, ascend to be with the Lord always, which of course we know is heaven. Just so we're straightforward and everybody's clear, let's put these things in order. We all experience the first death, don't we? Both good and bad, both redeemed and not redeemed. But the redeemed in Jesus get to experience the first resurrection, where they serve him as kings and priests and reign with him. But those that die without Jesus, they have to wait in Hades until the second resurrection, right? They have to wait in torment until the day of judgment. And when the second resurrection happens, the sea gives up its dead, Hades and death has to give up their dead, and then there is a judgment. And that judgment decides our eternal destiny. Heaven to be with the Lord always, or hell to be forever without the Lord. What's wonderful about this is that the decision is really yours. You know, Jesus throws it to us there in chapter 2. If you want to be an overcomer, then I'm going to make sure you get to experience heaven, the resurrection. But if you don't want to be an overcomer and you want to live selfishly, well, then you can live forever without me. The choice is ours. But what I want to bring out of this most of all is there life after death? There has to be life after death. And that's what this book is about, is that there's going to be things that are going to happen after. This is just the beginning. And when we're going to look at our lives from eternity, we're going to think this is a speck of time. There's so much going on after. There's so much to do. There's so many things that are going to happen that this is just the very beginning. One more question before we close. When Tabitha died, did she still have work to do? Did she still have service to do? You know, obviously Tabitha did a lot in her lifetime. And we already talked about how her good works would have lived on after her. But was Tabitha going to continue to serve the Lord after she died? I think we can actually have an answer to that question. In chapter 7 of Revelation, John sees the innumerable multitude. And the innumerable multitude is the Christian church. It's all those who've been saved everywhere for all time. And the reason why they're innumerable is because people are constantly being added to it. Every time someone obeys the gospel, they become part of this innumerable multitude. And this is what's said about this innumerable multitude. In Revelation 7, it's not in a future context. We're not in chapter 20 talking about heaven. But we're talking about a present day context in chapter 7. And this is what John says about the innumerable multitude, or the elder tells him. He said, "Who is this?" And he says, "Sir, you know." So he said to me, "These are the ones who come out of the great tribulation and washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Therefore, they are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple, and he who sits on the throne will dwell among them. It says that they serve him day and night in the temple. And when I read Revelation 7, I don't see an expiration date there. That this is something that begins, and I don't think it necessarily ever ends. The dead in Christ in Revelation 20, they continue to reign and serve God as priests in his temple. So they're still serving God too. When I read a lot of the parables, when Jesus talks about the end, he doesn't say, okay, you're done, you're finished. He usually says things like in the parables, well, you were a ruler over a few things, but now you'll be a ruler over many things, and I'm going to come and enter the joy of your Lord. I don't read in the Bible a concept of our service to the Lord stopping in death. When I look actually at all the evidence, this is what I believe. That even in death, our service to the Lord still continues. We certainly have rest from these broken mortal bodies. We certainly have rest from sin. But we are never given rest from serving the Lord. If we live this entire life serving the Lord here on this earth, why would we think it stopped in death? I believe we will continue to serve the Lord all the way to heaven. And then for eternity, we will continue to serve the Lord. So my question is, if Anita and Marita and Donna are still serving the Lord right now, then shouldn't we be serving the Lord right now as well? Absolutely. We should still be serving the Lord right now. We have brethren in the other realm that are still serving the Lord right now. And then one day we will all be reunited together around the throne. And what will we continue to be doing? We will be continuing to be serving the Lord right now. And that's something that gives me a lot of encouragement. That's something that gives me a lot of strength, is to know that all we have to do is have our robes washed with the blood of the Lamb, and we can continue to serve the Lord day and night with all of God's people. Thank you for your close attention. Let's be very clear. Donna Pridmore would have hated this sermon. Very first sermon I ever preached here. Not over the summer. It was in 2014. I made a comment about Donna, who had just started her cancer treatments, and I got in huge trouble. And she sent Al to go rebuke me for talking about her too much in a sermon. She would have hated this sermon. But, if she gets word that I did it again, maybe if an angel's present, tells her in paradise, I just like to make the record be perfectly clear. This sermon's not about Donna. This sermon is about Jesus and his church. Because like I said, there's going to come a time where there's going to be brethren in the earth, Lord willing, that don't know who Donna's name is. But whose name are they going to know? They are going to know the Lord's name. And the Lord has created this system where Jesus says at the very beginning, who is my mother and my brother and my sisters? Is those who know the Lord and keep his word. And Jesus has created this family for us to enjoy and to serve the Lord together. If there's anyone here that would like to be part of the household of God, why don't we let you assist you if you come forward as we stand and sing.